Hi, my name is Max Miller, and this is my partner Will Cassidy, and we're here to talk about a methane emission cap and trade strategy for the Columbia Environmental Policy Case Competition. So, what are we going to talk about? Well, first we're going to talk about why we chose methane and why we chose a cap and trade system. Then we're going to talk about ways that we can actually cut methane emissions, go into our actual policy recommendation, talk about the economic impact of that policy and the environmental impact, and then go into political feasibility of the proposal. So, why do we choose methane? Carbon dioxide is the #1 contributor to greenhouse gases, so why methane? Well, methane actually contributes about 25% of man-made global warming. That's because, even though carbon dioxide is relatively more present, we emit way more of it, methane's a much more effective greenhouse gas when it comes to trapping heat. It's actually 84 times as potent as carbon dioxide in the short run. Now, in the long run, that number drops to about 26%, but it's still a very effective and potent greenhouse gas. We focus on livestock in the agricultural sector, which represents about half of the agricultural sector's emissions for our proposal. Now, how do we go about actually cutting methane emissions? Cows emit methane through two different processes. One is enteric fermentation, which is shown by this lovely comic to my left, and the second is through manure. The manure that cows produce actually emit methane into the air sort of blatantly. It just sits there and emits. There's some pretty simple ways we can actually reduce emissions through enteric fermentation. One is to change the feeding strategies. There's been some great research by the Canadian equivalent of the EPA, or the Department of Agriculture, excuse me, that shows that through changing feeding strategies, particularly adding more lipids to the diet of cows, that we can actually decrease methane emissions by about 20%. Also, by adding different additives to cows' diets, such as dried active yeast, we can reduce methane emissions by an additional 6%. So some pretty strong gains that we can make right there. Also, on the manure side, using anaerobic digesters, we can reduce methane pretty significantly. It actually allows farmers to harvest that methane and turn it into biomass fuel. That's another source that farmers can gain revenue just right off the bat. So this is something that's very effective. Now, the EPA already has some programs like the AgStar program, which seeks to make the use of anaerobic digesters more diffuse among farmers. And it's been pretty effective. It's reduced methane emissions by about 2% since its introduction in 2000. So 2% in 13 years is not bad for a program, but we're hoping to expand that program and really get farmers to adopt anaerobic digesters at a higher level. We think we can be effective in that. Now, moving on, we see that we can implement many of these policies with little effect on productivity. We see all of these arrows facing up on this graph from the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization. Now, we can also do this at pretty low cost and with pretty large effect. We think that this policy, we don't think, we know, research shows that we can implement these things without much effect on productivity, so it can be a net economic win. In fact, productivity can increase in many of these cases. It can have some pretty great economic effects for farmers. Now, also moving on, we see that we can, next slide, we see that we can actually reduce methane emissions pretty heavily. We've seen some of these immediate reduction strategies, such as the feeding strategies or the additives. But also, in the long horizon, we can improve cow vaccines and actually, over time, alter the microbial populations of cows' stomachs to significantly reduce emissions. Now, we're a few years off from this, but this is something that is worth looking into over a long time horizon. This could have some very, very significant gains.
So once we decided on our cap and trade system, we had a couple of options. Our first of which is how do we allocate the permits? So kind of when you initially think about this, the most straightforward way is through a grandfathering system. You look at historical data, you say, okay, this farm has produced this much emissions, and you say, okay, we'll take that level X, allow the firm to produce that level X, and then over time, decrease the amount we allow them to emit. This actually has one big problem, in the sense that for a lot of these cases, we don't have good historical data on how much has been emitted. So in the past, they've said, all right, we'll set a 3-year window, and over this 3-year window, we'll measure how much you're emitting. and then at the end, we'll give you permits for that amount. The problem is firms start producing like crazy, and so that they get more permits at the end of this 3-year window. So we couldn't really go with this system. So our second option is an auction system. And in this, stakeholders bid at a price on permits, and then they get however many permits they successfully bid for. In particular, we consider something called an ascending clock auction, which is recommended by Kerr and Crampton in 2002. And in this case, you have a clock, it lists the price, firms list how much they demand, and then if demand is lower than supply, or demand is greater than supply, the clock increments until supply is greater than demand, and then you allocate based on that price and based on the demand schedules which have been submitted. Finally, and this is what we go with, there's a partial free auction, or partial free allocation, which kind of combines the two. So the first part is a pure auction system. We still are auctioning off most of the permits, but we say, all right, there are some firms which either have higher upfront cost because of what we're doing, or are particularly politically powerful, and so it's unlikely we can get legislation passed in this current form. So we say, okay, for these firms, we will give you some amount of free permits, auction off the rest, and then over time we transition completely to this pure auction system where we only are auctioning off permits.
Now, how do we actually enforce this mechanism? How do we find out on a micro level how much farms are producing? Well, or how much methane farms are producing? Well, we want to use a system similar to what the IRS uses with income taxes. We want farmers to self-report their methane emissions. We do this by sending out a survey and asking them questions. What do you feed your cows? What's in it? What kind of vaccines do you give them? Questions like that that can get at how much methane they're producing. This is a process-based model of methane emissions. Now, this graph right here represents how much we're going to have to fine farmers that underreport. Now, we're not able to audit every farm. That's just ludicrous. There are 1.3 million livestock farms in the United States. There's absolutely no way we can audit these, not all of them. But if we're able to audit 0.1% or 1%, we see that if we have sufficiently high fines, that we're actually able to reduce farmers' incentive to shirk. By solving this game, we actually see that as long as 1 minus S is greater than XP, which is the fine multiplied by the probability of audit, that farmers have no incentive to shirk. This result is overly simplistic. I mean, we don't include any sort of behavioral factors. There's no time discounting. It's a one-off, one-period game, but it gives us the intuition of what we need. We know we need high fines because we have a relatively low percentage of being audited.
So one of the primary questions that kind of immediately comes to mind is what kind of economic impact does this have? And it turns out it's an economic win. First of all, because they're comparatively low cost to farmers. We're not out to punish farmers. We're actually out to increase their productivity per head of cattle with fairly inexpensive ways. It's really quite effective for them as well as for the environment. Secondly, we're decreasing income taxes. This is a political expedient, but here it very clearly shows this is what economic theory would tell us to do. It's say tax an externality and keep distortionary taxes like taxes on labor as low as we possibly can. So that's exactly what we do. We take the taxes we've raised and then reinvest them in income taxes. Finally, there are opportunities for collecting economic rent, kind of gaming the system, but we try and limit those as much as possible. As an example, it's possible large farms will say, okay, smaller farms in this case are getting free permits. So therefore we should break up into smaller farms, and then from there we should also collect these rents. This will probably happen in the short run, but because of a long time horizon, we phase out our free permits to smaller farms. These won't last forever.
Now we get to what our project accomplishes. We are able to cut methane emissions while maintaining productivity. The agricultural sector has been in a huge boom over the last 7 to 10 years. We don't want to stop that in any way. We just want to make it more environmentally sustainable. This is what we're trying to do. We're trying to get from A to B. Our system accomplishes that.
So you might also think, all right, are agricultural firms going to leave the United States? Is it more effective if I'm a farmer for me just to pack up and leave? For a variety of reasons, I think this is not the case. First, we've already discussed, we're not really out to punish farmers, we're out to increase their productivity. Second of all, historically, the import penetration and export ratio of the United States for food is quite low. Therefore, that's unlikely to change tomorrow night. So we can still make it very effective for farmers to stay in the United States, continue to produce here, and also eliminate the possibility of methane leakage or economic prosperity leakage to other parts of the world. Now, we also touched upon this briefly, but one of the central findings of our research is that large farms in general are more effective and will produce less methane than small farms. For this reason, we will give small farms permits over some long time or short time horizon. So one potential unintended consequence is that larger farms will break up into smaller farms over this shorter time horizon. And effectively, yes, this will happen. We can't, the way we've structured it, we can't help that. But what we can say is that because we eventually phase out these free permits, there in the long run is no incentive to be a smaller farm. Rather, people will transition to this large farm, which is in fact more efficient in terms of producing methane.
Now for the environmental impact. We were able to cut methane emissions by 20 to 25% over a 10-year horizon with this policy. That also comes with a commensurate reduction in carbon dioxide and nitric oxide. Nitric oxide, like methane, is a very heavy gas and traps heat very well. We get all of this with this policy, and we do it while keeping economic gains over that horizon. This doesn't slow down the boom that we're seeing in the agricultural sector, it just makes it more environmentally sustainable. A tremendous policy improvement with the current methane regime, which essentially is nothing. We don't have any regulations in this area. It would seem like this would be pretty common sense legislation, but Will's going to tell you about some of the hurdles we have to tackle in order to get this thing passed.
So when you think about legislation, kind of the traditional way is you take a bill, you pass it through committee, it passes either the House or the Senate, it passes the other side of Congress, and then is signed into law by the President. For a variety of reasons, I don't think that's possible with this legislation. Even when Democrats, who are traditionally more sympathetic to this kind of legislation, had supermajorities in both houses of Congress and the presidency, they were unable to pass cap and trade. Therefore, we started thinking about this, and we thought, well, what if we pass it as a rider? Both Barack Obama and Mitch McConnell have said one of the things they think they can work on is tax reform. Now, our design includes lowering income taxes. We are taking the revenue we raise and recycling it into lowering income taxes. Therefore, why don't we add this as a rider, as an amendment to this larger bill, which will probably pass through both houses and be signed into law, and get it through that way, kind of as a piggyback on this larger bill. The other great thing about this is that if Republicans are trying to pass some kind of revenue-neutral tax reform, this is a great sweetener to liberal Democrats who otherwise might be less likely to support the legislation. They are going to be more sympathetic to this if they understand that there are environmental protections included in this kind of legislation. And even if this doesn't work, we still have one option left. Since Massachusetts versus the EPA in 2000, there has been increasing leverage. The EPA has increased its authority to deal with GHGs. So the EPA can say, all right, even though we couldn't pass it through legislatively, we'll say, here are our targets. These this is our time frame. Now we're going to pass this to the states to implement, and they are responsible for hitting these targets. Now, we don't have any guarantees with this route in the sense that states aren't obligated to follow the design which we have laid out. But the EPA can recommend that they use this system or a similar system, as well as setting hard and fast benchmarks.
All right, thank you guys for listening. We look forward to hearing back from you.
Thank you for your time.